As you know, we now have the debate session, disruption in the oil and gas industry. We heard Paul and Wim before the coffee break giving their presentations. And the division of labor, if you want to call it that, is so that I ask, you just heard me ask a few banal questions, I ask the broad and banal questions, and those of you in the audience with more industrial insight can just raise your hand and ask a more critical and perhaps complex question. So that's how it works, and we have 20 minutes. And I'd like to begin by asking, well, basically both of you, we've heard about this political pressure, and you know about this, to reduce carbon emission. And I want to ask you, Wim, initially, this pressure, doesn't it jeopardize or put some of the major players in the, you could call them fossil giants, in jeopardy?
Well, I don't think so, because it all takes time, right? And our assets are not infinite, so all the assets produced now over time will deplete. So when these measures come in, and they don't come overnight, it's a binary solution, so everything, nothing. So it will gradually come in. And then actually you can adapt with your portfolios. But you could argue that in the very long term, what else are you going to do?
Exactly.
But then our analysis, of course, shows you still need significant oil and gas, but you have to decarbonize it. The point is, can you still play in such world where probably cost will be paramount, right? And access to cheap resources. Maybe some government frameworks as well, which will be required to actually be able to operate, and having access to carbon capture and sequestration or not. There's a lot of these kind of things which come into play. The whole, everything becomes more complex because of the energy transition. But it won't be an abrupt from day one to day two, because it's not just the supply side, it's also the demand side. We have to change our cars, we have to change our homes, you know, not a gas boiler, but maybe a heat pump, and so on. Industry have to change, and that takes a long, long time. And here's a bit of a chicken egg situation as well, and I think the power sector is seeing that. Maybe at the moment it's the easy phase, just substitution, you know, for fossil fuels. But ultimately they have to build more capacity so that demand can make use of it, but they have to invest ahead of demand, and that will be quite difficult, I think, today's regulatory environment. But that's a chicken egg situation. So when you want to go to a lower carbon world, you have to somehow get a regulatory framework where you can build that supply, so being available. So for instance, if you want fuel cell cars, then you first have to build the whole hydrogen infrastructure, and then the cars will follow. And that needs to be somehow organized by society and industry in conjunction. Otherwise, that route will not happen.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to ask you the same question, Paul. I mean, basically, and at the end of the day, capitalism, if you like, is about survival of the fittest. And the industry obviously needs to adapt to changing environments. And do you see the industry being, on the longer run, being sufficiently fit to adapt to this low carbon reality that we're faced with?
Well, it will have to be sufficiently fit if it wants to participate in the future. It's clear again that the oil and gas demand will be there over the long term, but it's meeting that demand at an appropriate cost, and doing it in such a way that you can continue to make money. I think that there will be people left behind if the transition is more rapid than expected, for sure. But there is going to be a lot of legacy demand that needs to be met. So I think it will be a focus on cost, a focus on being extremely competitive, extra competitive. But and there will be winners and there will be losers, for sure. But there is a long-term future, definitely.
I think what we're driving at, and of course members of the industry know this much more in detail and better than I do, but seen from the, if you like, the spectator point of view, this talk of a disruption that we're here to debate. I mean, how deep is it? How do you see it, Wim? I mean, how much has it affected the oil and gas industry already?
Well, the disruption is well, so, when we talk about transition, we talk about multiple transitions. A lot of things going on at the same time. And it can be political, so it's a shift from west to east in population, economic terms, and therefore political terms, and who sets then the rules of the global trade. So that's a very broad theme, but will affect, say, how energy is consumed and how it's and where it's coming from. And then disruption what happens at the moment, for instance, in the oil market, where you see actually that OPEC has changed its policy and say, look, we just want to be a cost-competitive producer, which shifts the whole complex to more volumes cheaper earlier. That is really disruptive for our industry. Was that prompted by an innovation disruption in the industry itself, called the shale oil in the United States, or is it something in the back of the mind saying, well, if the Paris Agreement is be ratified, right, we don't have infinite time anymore to place our resources in the market, so maybe we should hurry up with that. And you never know that really, but so there are many of these disruptions playing together, I think, which then hits you because. Although you can in scenarios postulate that, but of course you never really respond till it actually hits you.
Exactly.
And then it is all about how resilient is your portfolio, how adaptive is your management, how is adaptive your organization to quickly respond to that. And I think the industry is, well, Paul, maybe you can comment on that, is I think relatively quickly responding to that with cutting costs, bringing new technology in, piggybacking from all the different industries like the digital industry, robotization. Yeah, you see it also in our industry now, and you see an acceleration of these new technologies coming in. All gold plating goes, right? Again, fit for purpose. And the industry have seen that throughout its history, every 10, 20 years you see that period, and they respond. So is it different this time? I don't think this time, but 20 years fast forward, I think we will be in a different position.
And what about you, Paul? Do you see the same scenario play out in 10, 20 years from now?
Well, I think what's really interesting is that you've almost got, and you alluded to it, Wim, about the kind of thinking about the future and reacting now, and that creates its own response. So if you do believe that the world may see lower demand growth in the future, or lower demand, then maybe the best strategy is to produce as much as you can now. But then that may also have an effect on where prices are and the dynamics that we're seeing in the marketplace today. So even before the disruption has actually happened, the perception that the disruption could happen in the future could be enough to engineer some change. Now, again, on the cost point, yeah, we've definitely seen some huge cost reductions particularly in the North American space in unconventional oil, and that's helped to allow that production to maintain at a relatively strong level, even at a low cost. So the industry is reacting to the conditions that it finds itself in, and you could even argue that it's positioning itself for a lower cost future by making those changes now. It's a very dynamic and fluid marketplace that we're in.
But both of you, I mean, maybe you're born optimists, but you make it sound as if, well, there are problems on the horizon, but these, well, not even real problems. These are just challenges, slight obstacles that can be overcome. Or maybe I'm interpreting what you're saying incorrectly.
I don't think we see it that way.
Okay,
I think we see, say, that the disruption very clearly, at least in our company, but also we see the reality of how long it takes. And just, just empirical evidence shows that when a new technology leaves the laboratory, it takes about 30 years and about 200 billion government subsidy to actually make it a 1% market share. And then it becomes mature. It actually can compete, which you see now in PV solar and wind. But then it takes another 30 years for that infrastructure to really develop its what I call natural market share, whatever that is, 10%, 15% of the market. So, okay, will it be much different this time? Well, we track very closely wind and solar, but actually they follow the historical empirical curves pretty close. I think our company is probably estimating the pace of change, one of the fastest in industry or out there. So we're not ignoring that. We realize it very much. But then it's like, what do you do? And what can you do? And what is, your strategic fit? Where are you really strong in doing? And what are your maybe competitors are, or the new industry is better? And then there are all kind of strategies around how you want to cope with that situation. Do you go for value but shrink? I mean, that's very much often you hear from shareholders of the city, right? That's a good strategy. Give me money back. I will invest it in something else. Or maybe more Dutch thinking that, okay, no, right, you're an energy company. You should actually do the energy transition for us as part of society, which is another kind of value proposition. So there are many different forces, I think, also from society, putting pressure on companies, how they ought to respond. And all I say is that but also then maybe people should realize, what is in our realm to respond, because you cannot change the law yourself or dictate the regulation, how you operate in a new field and how you recover your costs in the future. That all has to be done in a dialogue, very broad dialogue with society. And that's what we do as a company as Shell. We actually participate in a lot of these broad societal collaboration platforms where we just say, okay, we see it, but now we need actually that legislative foundation before we actually can really put our shoulders under it. So different ways to respond to that.
Right. Paul, that's a question obviously for the future, but when you look at the economic effect to Denmark and perhaps even more globally, if you like, if and when a shift from fossil fuel to more low carbon energies is complete, what will the effect be, you think?
Well, it's going to be different in different markets. I mean, Denmark, to use the example, is quite special in terms of its ability to capitalize on wind. The right geography for it,
right.
A legacy, an industry, a domestic industry, and also connection to a larger grid in Scandinavia, which allows those power flows to be balanced. So maybe the costs here are a little bit lower than they might be in other markets. I think it's an interesting question about where, is society prepared to bear the additional costs of moving towards? It's quite easy for world leaders to stand up and say we're going to cut 20% or 40% of the world's carbon budget, but when it comes to actually delivering that, there will certainly be a cost, and it will be down to the public and governments to accommodate that, and that has to be a choice that people will make. So I think that there will be there will be impacts, but we think that a certain move away from oil and gas is possible, and certainly from coal, at a relatively insignificant economic cost.
Mm-hmm. I know that there are one or two, you at least. Do you have a microphone?
Yeah, hi. Question for Paul, really. Ed Walsingham from International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. We're talking a little bit about political stability, and I just wanted you to comment in terms of Paris, the ratification and continued involvement in an agreement is only really as strong as the current government that's in power. With that in mind, what are your thoughts on the November elections in the States?
I knew a Donald Trump question was going to come up sooner or later. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. Like, it's an agreement that's only as strong as its participants want it to be. And there is precedent for the Kyoto Protocol. Canada actually just pulled itself out of Kyoto a number of years ago. So it's a political agreement. It provides some sort of direction, some sort of leadership, but it's also it doesn't really have any teeth in terms of penalties. So I agree. If Donald Trump wins the U.S. election, the U.S. participation in Paris will come under attack. Absolutely agree with that. And if Hillary Clinton wins, probably less so. Again, if the Senate remains Republican-dominated, there'll be issues. There's bound to be lawsuits, whatever happens. But ultimately, it's only as strong as its participants want it to be. And if its participants are there to provide leadership, then it will make an impact. But if things go backwards, and they could well do, I mean, Donald Trump's talking about reviving the U.S. coal industry and things like this, then we could be seeing something quite different.
Wim, basically the same question. Your thoughts on the potential outcome of the American presidential election in terms of your industry? Well, just in 10 minutes' time.
Yeah. Maybe it's not my line of expertise, so I should pass on. But from a slightly different angle, I think the United States is very competitive. So whoever candidate wins there, I mean, I think the wind and the solar industry and the gas industry will remain very competitive. So these energy transitions we start off with in the United States can still happen purely in economic terms, regardless then what kind of additional stimulus comes from the political side, because purely on the economics.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And in fact, if the US had signed up to the Kyoto Protocol, it would have largely met its commitments without any kind of burden from carbon pricing, just because of the impacts of unconventional gas have had on the power sector in pushing out coal, and because of the increasingly efficient consumption of electricity have actually reduced overall demand growth there as well.
Something noisy up here. Maybe it's me. We have another 2-3 minutes, Wim. I'd like to know, seen from your perspective, I mean, being a major player as you are, what are your sort of approach? What are your game changers? What is your secret strategy? Come on, it's among a set of friends. You can share it.
I think for a company like us, I think a technology like carbon capture sequestration is key, in any of the worlds, right? I mean, fast, slow decarbonization, a lot of fossils or not, but this carbon capture and sequestration will be required at some stage. But having it or not having it and when makes it enormous impact of what you can do as a company being in the oil and gas space. So that's quite an important external factor, right? Will it happen? Then I think when you look at the new space, new energies, I said also my speech, our focus is really on something we can do large scale and piggybacks on our strategic strengths like offshore operatorships and all stuff, large things, big ships and all the stuff. So large scale offshore wind, say mopping up electrons which cannot be placed in the market via electrolysis and hydrogen, spike it in existing gas grid, to basically reuse it, but then in different form. All these things are possible, and anyone can do that in a sense. But countries like Denmark, or same as the Netherlands, where I come from, they are particularly advantaged there because we have this enormous wind resource on our doorstep. We already have the gas infrastructure, so when you transition from one to the other, you can piggyback on existing infrastructures. And capabilities in your industry platform. So I think that's where, on the new energy space, we look very much in these kind of synergies. Where can we build that new energy platform, and how can we build scale? Because and maybe on the scale, give you an example. Of course, our company thinks in 1 million barrels of oil equivalent or something like that. It's a million barrels a day. That's what you have to think. In electricity terms, that you have to think about 100 gigawatt plus offshore wind. 100 gigawatt, what is that? 25,000 turbines, something like that. It's gigantic, really, on the today's scale. Right. But but still, that's important to large companies, right? Once you bring scale, you bring efficiencies, and and you can actually start dreaming about that to work in that space.
Right. I guess my final question will be for you, Paul, unless there is anyone else in here who wants to ask a question. But it doesn't seem to be the case. In that case, Paul, in the course of the next, say, 20 or 30 years, looking ahead, do you think there'll be a real viable alternative to oil and gas?
In some applications, yes. In some applications, no. Don't really ever see aviation moving away from hydrocarbon fuels unless some sort of biofuel revolution can take off. But excuse the pun. But in other markets, it could well be. I mean, again, just to think about that energy storage thing I mentioned. If you were to see cheap energy storage, and there are a lot of problems around that, then you suddenly could see a world which looks quite different. Lots of electric vehicles, lots of renewables, and the production and the consumption of energy become much more distributed, much more local, much in a very, very different model from what we have today. I think that's the biggest game changer. I don't know whether it's definitely going to happen or not. I think it's very difficult to predict breakthroughs, but if you were to see that breakthrough occur, you could see that radical shift. Otherwise, I really think that we're kind of tinkering at the margins to a large extent.
Okay, I think we'll let it stand where it is. Thank you very much, Paul and Wim.
Thank you. Thank you.